Morning, welcome to day 71 of the Collins Reading Aloud project. Another 1,000 words, starting now. Decimalisations, decimalize, decimalised, decimalises, decimalising, decimalism, decimalisms, decimalist, decimalists, decimalisation, decimalisations, decimalize, decimalised, decimalises, decimalising, decimally, decimals, decimate, decimated, decimates, decimating, decimation, decimations, decimator, decimators, decime, decimes, decimeter, decimeters, decimeter, decimeters, decimetric, decinormal, decipher, decipherability, decipherable, deciphered, decipherer, decipherers, deciphering, decipherment, decipherments, deciphers, decision, decisional, decisioned, decisioning, decisions, decisive, decisively, decisiveness, decisivenesses, decisory, decistare, decistairs, decitizenize, decitizenized, decitizenizes, decitizenizing, decitizenize, decitizenized, decitizenizes, decitizenizing, decivilize, decivilized, decivilizes, decivilizing, decivilize, decivilized, decivilizes, decivilizing, deck, deck chair, deck chairs, decked, deckle, deckles, decker, deckers, deckhand, deckhands, deckhouse, deckhouses, decking, deckings, deckle, deckled, deckles, deckless, deco, decode, decoing, decos, decks, declaim, declaimant, declaimants, declaimed, declaimer, declaimers, declaiming, declaimings, declaims, declamation, declamations, declamatorily, declamatory, declarable, declarant, declarants, declaration, declarations, declarative, declaratively, declarator, declaratorily, declarators, declaratory, declare, declared, declaredly, declarer, declarers, declares, declaring, declass, declass, declassed, declasse, declasses, declassifiable, declassified, declassifies, declassifying, declassify, declassifying, declassing, declaw, declawed, declawing, declaws, declension, declensional, declensionally, declensions, declinable, declinal, declinals, declinant, declinants, declinate, declination, declinational, declinations, declinator, declinatories, declinators, declinatory, declinature, declinatures, decline, declined, decliner, decliners, declines, declining, declinist, declinists, declinometer, declinometers, declivities, declivitus, declivity, declivus, declutch, declutched, declutches, declutching, declutter, decluttered, decluttering, declutters, deco, decoct, decocted, decoctible, decocting, decoction, decoctions, decoctive, decocts, decocture, decoctures, decode, decoded, decoder, decoders, decodes, decoding, decodings, decoherence, decoherences, decoherer, decoherers, decoke, decoked, decokes, decoking, decollate, decollated, decollating, decollated, decollates, decollating, decollation, decolations, decollator, decollators, decolletage, decolletages, decollete, decollettes, decolonisation, decolonisations, decolonise, decolonised, decolonises, decolonising, decolonisation, decolonisations, decolonise, decolonised, decolonises, decolonising, decolour, decolorant, decolorants, decolorate, decolorated, decolorates, decolorating, decoloration, decolorations, decoloured, decoloring, decolorisation, decolorisations, decolorize, decolorised, decoloriser, decolorisers, decolorises, decolorising, decolorisation, decolorisations, decolorize, decolorised, decoloриser, decolorisers, decolorises, decolorising, decolours, decolour, decoloured, decoloring, decolorisation, decolorise, decolorised, decolorises, decolorising, decolorisation, decolorise, decolorised, decolorises, decolorising, decolours, decommission, decommissioned, decommissioner, decommissioners, decommissioning, decommissions, decommit, decommits, decommitted, decommitting, decommunisation, decommunise, decommunised, decommunises, decommunising, decommunisation, decommunise, decommunised, decommunises, decommunising, decompensate, decompensated, decompensates, decompensating, decompensation, decompensations, decomplex, decomposability, decomposable, decompose, decomposed, decomposer, decomposers, decomposes, decomposing, decomposite, decomposites, decomposition, decompositions, decompound, decompoundable, decompounded, decompounding, decompounds, decompress, decompressed, decompresses, decompressing, decompression, decompressions, decompressive, decompressor, decompressors, deconcentrate, deconcentrated, deconcentrates, deconcentrating, deconcentration, decondition, deconditioned, deconditioning, deconditions, decongest, decongestant, decongestants, decongested, decongesting, decongestion, decongestions, decongestive, decongests, deconsecrate, deconsecrated, deconsecrates, deconsecrating, deconsecration, deconsecrations, deconstruct, deconstructed, deconstructing, deconstruction, deconstructions, deconstructive, deconstructor, deconstructors, deconstruct, decontaminant, decontaminants, decontaminate, decontaminated, decontaminates, decontaminating, decontamination, decontaminative, decontaminator, decontaminators, decontextualize, decontextualize, decontrol, decontrolled, decontrolling, decontrols, decor, decorate, decorated, decorates, decorating, decoratings, decoration, decorations, decorative, decoratively, decorativeness, decorator, decorators, decorous, decorously, decorousness, decorousnesses, decors, decorticate, decorticated, decorticates, decorticating, decortication, decortications, decorticator, decorticators, decorum, decorums, decos, decoupage, decoupaged, decoupages, decoupaging, decouple, decoupled, decoupler, decouplers, decouples, decoupling, decouplings, decoy, decoyed, decoyer, decoyers, decoying, decoys, decrassified, decrassifies, decrassifying, decrassify, decrassifying, decrease, decreased, decreases, decreasing, decreasingly, decreasings, decree, decreeable, decreed, decreeing, decreer, decreers, decrees, decrete, decretes, decrement, decremental, decremented, decrementing, decrements, decrepit, decrepitate, decrepitated, decrepitates, decrepitating, decrepitation, decrepitations, decrepitly, decrepitness, decrepitnesses, decrepitude, decrepitudes, decrescents, decrescences, decrescendo, decrescendos, decrescent, decretal, decretalist, decretalists, decretals, decretist, decretists, decretive, decretory, decrew, decrued, decrewing, decrews, decrial, decrials, decried, decrier, decriers, decries, decriminalize, decriminalized, decriminalizes, decriminalizing, decriminalize, decriminalized, decriminalizes, decriminalizing, decrown, decrowned, decrowning, decrowns, decrustation, decrustations, decry, decrying, decrypt, decrypted, decrypting, decryption, decryptions, decrypts, dectet, dectets, decubital, decubiti, decubitus, decuman, decumans, decumbents, decumbencies, decumbencies, decumbency, decumbent, decumbently, decumbiture, decumbitures, decumulation, decumulations, decuple, decupled, decuples, decupling, decuria, decurias, decuries, decurion, decurionates, decurionates, decurions, decurrencies, decurrency, decurrent, decurrently, decursion, decursions, decursive, decursively, decurvation, decurvations, decurve, decurved, decurves, decurving, decury, decussate, decussated, decussately, decussates, decussating, decussation, decussations, dedal, dedalian, dedans, dedenda, dedendum, dedendums, dedicant, dedicants, dedicate, dedicated, dedicatedly, dedicatee, dedicatees, dedicates, dedicating, dedication, dedicational, dedications, dedicative, dedicator, dedicatorial, dedicators, dedicatory, de-differentiate, dedimus, dedimuses, de-dramatize, dedramatized, dedramatizes, dedramatizing, dedramatize, dedramatized, dedramatizes, dedramatizing, deduce, deduced, deducement, deducements, deduces, deducibilities, deducibility, deducible, deducibleness, deduciblenesses, deducibly, deducing, deduct, deducted, deductibilities, deductibility, deductible, deductibles, deducting, deduction, deductions, deductive, deductively, deducts, deduplicate, deduplicated, deduplicates, deduplicating, deduplication, deduplications, deed, deeded, deeder, deedest, deedful, deedier, deediest, deedily, deeding, deedless, deeds, deedy, deeing, DJ, DJ'd, DJing, DJings, DJs, deek, deely, deem, deemed, deeming, deems, deemster, deemsters, deemstership, deemsterships, dean, deans, deep, deepen, deepened, deepener, deepeners, deepening, deepenings, deepens, deeper, deepest, deep felt, deep freeze, deep freezes, deep freezing, deep froze, deep frozen, deepy, deepies, deeply, deepmost, deepness, deepnesses, deeps, deep water man, deep water men, deer, deer berries, deer berry, deer, deers, deer flies, deer fly, deer grass, deer grasses, deer horn, deer horns, deer hound, deer hounds, deerlet, deerlets, deer like, deers, deer skin, deer skins, deer stalker, deer stalkers, deer stalking, deer stalkings, deer weed, deer weeds, deer yard, deer yards, dees, deet, deets, deeve, deeve, deeved, deeves, deeving, deeves, D1, D1s, def, deface, defaceable, defaced, defacement, defacements, defacer, defacers, defaces, defacing, defacingly, defecate, defecated, defecates, defecating, defecation, defecations, defecator, defecators, defalcate, defalcated, defalcates, defalcating, defalcation, defalcations, defalcator, defalcators, defamation, defamations, defamatorily, defamatory, defame, defamed, defamer, defamers, defames, defaming, defamings, defang, defangs, defanging, defangs, defast, defast, defat, defats, defatted, defatting, default, defaulted, defaulter, defaulters, defaulting, defaults, defeasance, defeasance, defeasances, defeasibilities, defeasibility, defeasible, defeasibleness, defeat, defeated, defeater, defeaters, defeating, defeatism, defeatisms, defeatist, defeatists, defeats, defeature, defeatured, defeatures, defeaturing, defecate, defecated, defecates, defecating, defecation, defecations, defecator, defecators, defect, defected, defectibilities, defectibility, defectible, defecting, defection, defectionist, defectionists, defections, defective, defectively, defectiveness, defectivenesses, defectives, defector, defectors, defects, defeminization, defeminizations, defeminize, defeminized, defeminizes, defeminizing, defeminization, defeminizations, defeminize, defeminized, defeminizes, defeminizing, defense, defensed, defenseless, defenselessly, defenselessness, defenceman, defencemen, defenses, defensing, defend, defendable, defendant, defendants, defended, defender, defenders, defending, defends, defenestrate, defenestrated, defenestrates, defenestrating, defenestration, defenestrations, defensitive, defensitives, defense, defensed, defenseless, defenselessly, defenselessness, defenceman, defencemen, defences, defensibilities, defensibility, defensible, defensibleness, defensibly, defensing, defensive, defensively, defensiveness, defensivenesses, defensives, defer, deferrable, deference, deferences, deferent, deferential, deferentially, deference, deferment, deferments, deferrable, deferables, deferral, deferrals, deferred, deferrer, deferrers, deferring, defers, defervescence, defervescences, defervescencies, defervescency, defeudalize, defeudalized, defeudalizes, defeudalizing, defeudalize, defeudalized, defeudalizes, defeudalizing, defer, defist, deafly, defo, deafy, defiance, defiances, defiant, defiantly, defiantness, defiantnesses, defibrillate, defibrillated, defibrillates, defibrillating, defibrillation, defibrillations, defibrillator, defibrillators, defibrinate, defibrinated, defibrinates, defibrinating, defibrination, defibrinations, defibrinized, defibrinized, defibrinizes, defibrinizing, defibrinized, defibrinized, defibrinizes, defibrinizing, deficients, deficiencies, 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 deficient, deficiently, deficientness, deficientnesses, deficients, deficit, deficits, defied, defier, defiers, defies, defilade, defiladed, defilades, defilading, defile, defiled, defilement, defilements, defiler, defilers, defiles, defiliation, defiliations, defiling, definabilities, definability, definable, definably, define, defined, definement, definements, definer, definers, defines, definienda, definiendum, definiens, definientia, defining, definite, definitely, definiteness, definitenesses, definites, definition, definitional, definitions, definitize, definitized, definitizes, definitizing, definitive, definitively, definitiveness, definitives, definitize, definitized, definitizing, definitizing, definitizes, definitizing, definitude, definitudes. That's 1,000, and I'll carry on tomorrow.